The topic here is the Forest Management Plan update. This is going to be the plan going forward from 2020 to 2040. So our next 20 years of forest management, building on the work that's been done up to date. And we spent probably longer than we wanted getting this together. But I think the product that we got is based on a level of understanding that we didn't necessarily have, and is certainly a level of detail of information, data that we certainly didn't have before. And kudos to Charlie for guiding us through this process, but also doing a lot of heavy lifting of going out and revisiting all of our forest stands and learning how to operate a GIS system, getting all that data into the GIS through a tablet out in the field, and then going home and getting on his computer and figuring out how to make all this work. I'm not going to go into the functionality of the GIS in any detail today. I know that John actually has really gotten into this, and he actually put together a video which he invited everyone to look at on YouTube that he made about GIS. And we can do more of that sort of thing to talk about how we can use this in the future. But the basic point is now we have a lot of information to work with to make decisions, and everything in this management plan basically should be considered today's concept, which is amenable to change as we learn more about how things work and don't work, our forest changes over time, etc. And the GIS will help us to make decisions about where to do harvest, what types of harvest, etc., based on that increasing knowledge over time. So this is very much an adaptive approach to forest management. And as you'll see, there are some uncertainties here that would suggest that such an approach would be appropriate. So I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on the background here. We all know what the purpose of the plan is. We have about 1,800 acres that are suitable for forest management. We have three principal objectives, which is biodiversity conservation, public recreation, enjoyment of forests, and revenue generation. So all three of those go on decisions about when and where and how to do harvests. Here are the locations of our various forests for those who aren't familiar. And we all know that we generally sit in a context of hemlock, hardwood, pine, and Appalachian oak pine forests, and that some of those areas have been identified as being high priorities for biodiversity conservation. In particular, the northern part of town where we have our largest holding of forest land, being Joe English and Betty Arnold Forest. We had a couple of presentations in the past where we talked about sort of the contextual challenge that we're dealing with here, and that is basically we have a lot of forest that sits on what was abandoned agricultural and grazing land. As a result, we have these even-aged, kind of middle-aged forests. And as a result, those forests don't have a lot of heterogeneity, nor do they have a lot of mortality and blowdowns, which are effectively the mechanism for creating heterogeneity. So in an older forest, you'll have areas that get blown down, knocked down in ice storms, might be susceptible to fire, etc. That'll create gaps, and then we have young forests that grow up in that. And as you develop a mosaic of that across a landscape, you have different types of habitat that are good for different parts of the life cycle of the species that are common to our landscape. Just to look at this a little bit more quantitatively, the ideal distribution as theorized by Richard DeGraff of the U.S. Forest Service looks a little bit like what you see in the histogram represented by the green bars, okay? I have juxtaposed that with these blue bars, which is basically the age distribution of our forest. And what you can see is relative to the theorized ideal for wildlife habitat, we have an overrepresentation of some of the age classes, which we'll call saw timber and large saw timber, okay? So What he proposes is we'd want a lot more younger forest. So that would be the seedling, sapling, and pole forest age classes. And there we're very underrepresented. It's not the only way of looking at this. This is one theory, and it's a widely supported theory, and certainly one that is promoted by wildlife management authorities in the Northeast, you will see from the various relevant departments in New Hampshire suggestions that we need to get more young forest in the mix. You can take a different approach, sort of the non-interventionist approach, and say, well, what I really would like to see is a forest that is similar to what the colonists might have found when they came ashore hundreds of years ago. And that forest, we don't know very much about. There aren't really good records of that. And so various researchers have tried to cobble together some sort of idea of what that might have looked like based on, what kind of evidence, physical evidence they can find, and understanding basically the ecology and forest dynamics that we do have, what would have likely been there. And in that case, we believe that the pre-colonial forest had a very large portion in this antique age class, this kind of, late succession, some folks might call old growth forest. And then sort of a, otherwise even distribution of these different age classes: seedling, sapling, pole, saw timber, large saw timber. So again, I've juxtaposed that with the blue bars, which is our current state of affairs. And you can see that we are still a bit underrepresented in the younger age classes and overrepresented in the middle age classes, basically what you'd expect to see. And if almost nothing in that old growth category, which is also what you'd expect to see, considering that most of the forest we have has grown up in the last 100 years.
Hey, Jared.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Are the percentages you're showing ACC holdings or Amherst wide?
They are our forest, the 1,800 acres that we have.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so we have those two different views, and the question is, what do we do with this? What should we shoot for? Well, we know that if we took a completely hands-off approach and just said, just let it rip and let nature take care of things, what we're going to do is we're going to fall short of young age classes for some time to come. We'll eventually get there. Our forests will get old and we'll start to have natural disturbance, probably not the way that it used to happen, just because our landscape is so fragmented with development. For example, you wouldn't see forest fires getting very big if they ever occurred. You don't see a lot of as much beaver activity as you'd expect to see, but we'd have the blowdowns and whatnot, so we'd get that heterogeneity. How long that would take? Maybe couple hundred years. So we could accelerate that process and get ourselves into a state where we have more young forest without making a big judgment call about whether we're going for this upper graph or the lower graph. We know in both cases, we probably need to have more young forest. We don't really know what comes of the ecology of these old growth forests because they're so rare. There may be very interesting things that we would like to have in our forests that come about because of those old growth. I mean, some of the things that are obvious that we know is when trees get older and die and there's more snags, they create more habitat, better habitat conditions for species like woodpeckers and things like that. But I mean, you can take this to an infinite level of complexity, looking at, microorganisms and whatnot, and fungi, what exists in those old forests. We don't really know what to expect, but it's probably something worthy of consideration of having in the mix as more old growth. And the last point I'd like to make is we are in a very dynamic period right now. If predictions are correct, we should be experiencing a warming trend, and in many of our lifetimes, we're going to be living in an environment that's more akin to, say, North Carolina than it is to New England. So that's going to have an effect, and we can't predict how that will play out in the dynamics of the various species that live in our forests. So that's something we just got to figure out on the fly. One thing, though, we do know is that heterogeneity is probably good for us in that context. For example, if a pathogen were to come in and favor a certain type of tree, and it happened that we have very homogeneous stands, we could be very badly affected. Whereas we have a lot of heterogeneity, these different stressors that would come along wouldn't affect us so ubiquitously if we happen to be in the sweet spot of what that stressor affected. So that also suggests that doing some forest management is a good idea to kind of mix it up. Okay, so in the past, I really started the clock in 1998. There's obviously centuries of things that have happened in our forest before that, but we're starting our clock in 1998 when we have Charlie's good records of what he's done in our forests. So effectively the last 22 years of forest management. And basically during that time, we had two different types of silvicultural treatments. We had group selection, openings, low thinning, and crown thinning. Here's just a quick history of this. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but you can find that if you want to study this table any more closely in the forest management plan. Around 2012, Charlie started experimenting with doing larger group openings and kind of moving away from the thinnings. On the right in these images, you can see an opening that was done in Hazeltine back in, what was that, 2018, I guess. No, sorry, that was in 2016. And this bottom picture is that same site. I actually put a photo point in there, and I've been taking a picture of it every year just to kind of get a record of how that's regenerating. So you can see it's coming back. This structurally makes for very nice habitat of the type we're looking for. So for example, birds and bats are going to utilize this in a way that they can't utilize a forest, that's surrounding it. You'll also see various mammals utilizing these sites. There's good forage in there. There's berries, young saplings they can eat, etc. I have put in camera traps in some of these openings, and you see basically what you'd expect to see. A lot of different mammals coming in there and foraging. So that's working on a structural level. One thing that might not be working though is the effect this is having on species composition relative to what we expected to achieve. And, as we've gone out and looked to see whether or not, for example, we're getting a robust regeneration of oaks, what we're finding is that the oaks are in there, but they've been nibbled down every year since they started to appear. And so we have, 6-year-old oaks that are, 5 inches tall. And we have other species that are thriving that aren't the species that we necessarily wanted. So now oak are great to have if we're looking at wildlife because they create hard mast, and they also host insects, in particular caterpillars and whatnot, that are really important in the trophic chain. So we would love to continue to have a good, rich oak forest like we currently have. And we're blessed with that. Now, there's some questions like, how did we end up with that oak forest? We don't actually know the answer to that because there may have been human interventions that actually caused us to have such a high density of oaks, such as treatment with fire. So it may not be a natural condition, but we do know that when we put in these big cuts, the deer are coming in, they're eating down the oak, and in some cases it's bad. In the bottom picture here, this is in Dakino. That is, I don't know, Charlie, was that 8 years old now? In there, it's probably on mute. Anyway, it's been some time since that was cut, and that's all we have for regeneration. So they've been eating that down pretty hard. And what is coming up principally over in Dakino are, areas where you see a lot of fern and then black birch and beech in some cases. So that's not the forest that we want from a composition point of view, but as a structural point of view, when I say structure, I'm saying basically the size of the trees that we're looking for. So we're getting some ecological function out of that we wanted, but if we were to keep doing this at scale, we might end up with a very different forest, over the next cycle of management. So in this 20 years, if we did a bunch of these cuts, we could end up actually converting our forest into something different than what it is. today. So that is a concern that I have going forward. So what I'm proposing is that we take a kind of an adaptive approach, and we focus on the fact that we do want to sustain this very large block of forest we have, which is somewhat special, actually, especially as all the fragmentation and development's coming up from the south. We want to really focus on doing a good job of maintaining unfragmented forest. And we want to do this in a somewhat experimental way, given that there are some uncertainties as what's going to happen if we keep cutting the way that we've been. So we're gonna have to figure out which interventions are the most effective. And what I'm gonna do is suggest a series of interventions that we can do that will allow us to have better visibility of what works and doesn't work, okay? So one of the things we wanna do always when we go into these cuts is have a vision towards wildlife habitat enhancement. So there's a variety of things that we can do anytime we do interventions. So John was so good to put together this list. And these are kind of like basics of good management for wildlife. So that's always in the mix going forward. So, common examples, and you see them all around, like we've been doing this, like leaving snags. So snags are dead trees that are standing. Oftentimes you'll see where there's a forest cut and there's just a single dead tree standing in the middle of it. And someone might ask, why is that there? Why not knock it over, et cetera? The reason is, if you stand around long enough, you're going to see birds coming and going, and maybe a porcupine in there or whatnot, utilizing that snag for habitat. So, those sort of simple, straightforward things we always want to do. Okay, so let's see what we've got here in the next slide. So as I mentioned, we put together the GIS. We have divided our holdings into about 200 stands. And on each of those stands, we actually have a list of variables, 40 variables that were measured in each of those stands. So we know quite a lot now about what exactly sits where in our forest. If you look on the map on the right, you can see color-coded are the general areas. So this would be like Joppa Hill, Joe English, Betty Arnold, et cetera. And if you look more closely, hopefully you can see it on your monitors, there are these lines throughout. Those are the polygons for each of those stands. So the stands will vary as you go across the landscape because you have different soil conditions, different aspects, different water, et cetera. So you'll get changes in species composition, age, et cetera, over the landscape. And so that's all been mapped out by Charlie. So this is the product of a tremendous amount of work. Again, great thanks to Charlie for doing that. And then we can use our GIS to search all of these stands by attributes. So you say, tell me where we have our highest density of invasive species. And it'll light up the stands that have the highest density of invasive species. Then we can say, okay, if we have an invasive species strategy, we know where to go. And you can do a variety of other much more exciting things, which John would be happy to demonstrate in our follow-on presentation. So here are some outputs from that kind of an analysis. All right, so our first proposed intervention is control invasive species via herbicides and mechanical treatments. We've identified stands in 4 of our forests, okay? Those are, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the stands indicated in blue are the ones where we know we have a high level of invasive species, okay? And we know specifically which species are in those places so that we can kind of get Lee lined up to go ahead and do what he needs to do in terms of contracting people or get in there himself and do work on these different sites. So that's an obvious one. We know we need to do that. No big decisions about, what are the effects on species, species composition, big cuts or anything like that. All we're saying is got to control invasive species before they get out of hand. And something else I should point out about that, which I found stunning, is that we watched a presentation a couple of weeks ago in Connecticut, and they were showing that heavy deer browse was actually taking out native species and actually opening space for invasive species. So if you've got them in there and you've got deer, chances are the deer are going to accelerate the spread of invasive species. And they showed us some pretty sobering pictures of like complete understory coverage of invasive species in areas where they weren't hunting. So something to keep in mind as we talk about this in the future. Intervention 2 is diversifying age classes via group selection harvests and shelter wood. So group selection harvests are the ones you're familiar with, you've seen already. I showed you a picture earlier of that. Shelter wood's a different approach, same kind of objective, but what you do is you take out a good portion of the trees, leaving a few mature trees and any kind of advanced regeneration that's already existing in that area. And so instead of just kind of hitting reset all at once by taking out everything in a group selection, you're leaving the carefully selected seed trees to promote regeneration of the species you want, and you're protecting the advanced regeneration when you went into that harvest. The idea being that you can potentially get better regeneration of the species that you wanted before you take out the remaining large trees. And when you do that, you release all of those understory trees that you have promoted. And so that's a sort of a two-stage process that takes place over a few years. So we've identified stands in 3 forests where that could be done. And in Boutel, which is on the right, we actually have an opportunity based on past forest management to try something it's a kind of a twist on the shelter wood, which we're kind of called the shifting variant, where we're basically kind of combining the effects of past management through group selection and whatnot with the shelter wood to see if we can get an interesting effect there. One of the things that I really want to do here, and as you can see, is I want to minimize the scale of these experiments in most places. So here you can see in Joe English, we got one stand, number 22. This has various attributes that I like. One is it's easy to get to. So we can actually do this intervention with very little disruption. You can use the existing Old Brook Road to get to it. Go in, do that intervention. And if it doesn't work out the way we expected, we haven't lost much. We can, we have a lot of surrounding forests. It's basically going to, eventually help to compensate for our mistakes. And so same goes over in Pond Parish. We can get in here totally out of view of the people who use Pond Parish because the trails are actually elsewhere. And there's another road that kind of runs along the south end here. We can get in there and do that intervention, experiment, see what happens. And have minimum disruption on the recreational use of that area. Intervention 3, it looks big, but it's a relatively small area. It's Hazeltine. We have basically a fairly overstocked forest here. So this was just a different approach. Was just reducing the density of the stand so that the existing trees that we like have more resource, basically light, water, etc., space to grow. And we can go in there and thin out trees that we don't necessarily want to promote and leave the trees we want. And we'll end up with a forest that's a little bit more open than we currently see there. And hopefully, cultivating a good population of the oaks and whatnot that we really want to see thrive in that forest. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we want to have more old growth forest. If we're going to do that, we got to make a decision now as to which areas we want to protect, because you can't change your mind. This is a long-term commitment if we're going to get those forests. So John dazzled us with his new expertise in GIS and actually did an analysis of sort of the areas that are least economic and least accessible, and got this output, which fortunately coincided with Charlie's idea also of where he'd like to see some old growth. And so you can see a big area of Joe English. If you go down the Old Brook Road towards the Beaver Pond, most of the area to the right there, we could just say from here on out, just don't mention doing any kind of interventions there. We're going to let that grow. We have an area that's kind of an abandoned island off of Brook Road, just north of Betty Arnold. And that's another option. We can add others, but those two seem kind of like no-brainers because they're hard to get to and they're uneconomic to harvest. So why not start now with those? So what I'd like to do with these kind of effectively experiments in some cases, certainly the group selections and the shelter wood and the thinnings is I want to take an adaptive management approach, which basically is, sort of the, common parlance, kind of the plan, do, check, act approach for resource management. And we want to monitor what's going on in the areas after we cut them and look to see if we're getting invasive species, pests and disease, and the regeneration that we're after. And just make sure that these things are actually working the way we expected. If they're not, then we should not go to scale with the interventions that we have. Okay, so we would need to rethink what we want to do to achieve certain effects. I put together a short plan. I don't know how legible this is on your screens, but basically by year, I have various interventions planned and monitoring activities identified, as well as some conditions for moving forward on different things based on achieving the outcomes that we're really after. And again, this is kind of draft 1.0 for what we're doing for the next 20 years. In 3 years or 5 years, we might, based on what we've learned at that point, say, throw the brakes on intervention 2 and do more of intervention 3 based on what we're seeing. Or add something we hadn't thought of. That's all basically in play. This should be considered a dynamic plan, but this kind of gives us that initial sketch of what we think we should do over the next 20 years.